Well, while they're designing the city and speech, they come to a realization. They're going to need different types of people to perform different functions in their city. And I think, at least, that in his writing, through the mouth of Socrates, and it's always hard to keep those two straight, Plato and Socrates, Plato is implying that in a city, in a political order, you have to have multiple kinds of virtue or excellence. And so I want to make that distinction very clear right up front. And when I say virtue, I mean virtue in the Greek sense, arete, is in a worldly kind of excellence. So you can think of things like courage, something that anybody at any time is really going to be able to say, oh yeah, that's a good thing for a human being to have. Not in the theological sense. I think having theological virtue completely destroys Plato's worldview. And we'll talk about that at the end. And I think that when Plato proposes through Socrates these two kinds of virtue, really two main kinds of virtue, he's turning some human beings into essentially human dogs, and he's turning some of them into Platonic saints. And I think what he is suggesting to us is that, at least for him, in his Greek paradigm, the idea of a political community is inherently unequal. I don't think that works, but that's because I lived after Plato. So, I'm going to explain basically, and I think I'm going to prove sufficiently, and you guys can question me if you don't think I did, that there are two excellences present in Plato's Republic. So we'll go ahead and start with the auxiliaries, or the guardians, the military. Oh, and on that handout, by the way, I've left the outline of the presentation in a little passage that I don't want to read in its entirety because it's long, but it's very, very important for the end of the paper. And I highlighted, underlined, and bolded that really important section at the back end. So we'll start with the education of the auxiliaries, of the guardians. So quickly, in the Republic, the interlocutors realize they're going to need some sort of military protection. And so they start discussing how they should educate their protectors. Now, here's the interesting thing. They don't talk about how they should learn tactics. Like they don't set up anything that we would recognize as a West Point. They start by talking about performing arts, essentially. The Alan Bloom translation tends to use the word speeches and music, which is essentially what that means is plays and actual music, performing arts. And they put some very strict requirements on what kind of performing arts can be shown in the city and speech. So in 380 and 391, they talk about how, well, they can't, these guardians can't be exposed to gods doing evil, gods fighting gods, here at chucking Hephaestus off Olympus, that's not going to be allowed. Also, interestingly, they can't be shown heroes lamenting the fallen. So there goes the Iliad, like straight out of the gate. There's no Homer in this city and speech. And that's pretty interesting. And so, but why do they do that? Why do they do that? Why focus on that? Because according to Socrates, and it's really kind of difficult again to say whether Socrates is Plato here, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that Socrates is Plato. At 606, he says that performing arts set up like desires for the beautiful as rulers in us. And his idea is, well, if we can make the virtues, the excellences in the soldiers that we want, if we can make those beautiful, and we can kind of suppress their need for dialectic. I'm going to come to that later. But there's no mention of discussion and debate among this military faction of the society. They're pretty much exposed to gymnastics and performing arts. You get two things, and he talks about these two things that he's going to get in 375. You get people who are incapable of behaving rapaciously towards the city. Always important. They believe in the principle of one man, one art, so one group has the weapons, which means you really got to train that group well. And they must be willing to die in defense of the city. That's what you need, nothing else. You can't have people who start to question, whether something is good or not. You can't have all of the people with the weapons suddenly questioning whether or not the city should continue to exist or whether or not they should care about their fellow citizens. It's going to be a huge problem. Even if they just decide to experiment, you've got a massive problem. But what about the rulers? Now, the rulers in Plato's Republic do come from the auxiliaries. They're the most powerful, the most prudent, the most loyal to the city. There's several requirements. There's tests to figure out who's going to be in the ruling class. But they're going to be trained a little bit differently in the best city. The rulers do have to learn dialectic, which is essentially like high school debate. I mean, they learn it a little bit later in life than high school, but that's what it is. It's debate. And the idea is that this dialectic, and they mentioned this in 484, that this dialectic allows the rulers to learn to see the good itself, which is probably as close as Socrates comes to an idea of God, I think. The good in itself. And with that good comprehended, he wrote it in Greek, not in Latin, otherwise I'd make a joke about ablative absolutes. With that good being comprehended, the rulers can then be sharp-sighted watchers over the city. They can then govern the city appropriately